I have been very busy with WUFI at the moment. I'm getting a lot of requests for these sorts of assessments, so it's definitely picking up in awareness in the industry and popularity. I think it's popular because it's an on-paper assessment. You get a number, sort of like a blow door test. You get a number and it gives you some information. And if it does turn out that your wall or roof system has a layer that is going to throw a mold index of 5, then you know that you have to do something about that. You have to change a membrane. You have to introduce a ventilated cavity. You have to change your material to a more mold resistant product. Any number of sort of further risk mitigation strategies to make sure that what you're building is actually going to be safe and healthy.
Can you talk through perhaps some of the other things that are tools or, information or checks that people could use? Obviously one thing that's really lacking in Australian building codes is an as-built verification process. There really is nothing that enables a homeowner to get confirmation from their builder that things have been built to the National Construction Code, things have been built to the star rating that the design was measured at. And so it does come down to the homeowner finding the right team to work with, but then also perhaps building in some processes into the contractual arrangement that enables them to get these things checked during construction. What do you suggest people sort of, is there a kit of things that they can think about? What do you suggest they sort of consider as they're setting up their construction process to get a really good outcome?
I would definitely discuss the air tightness thing at the beginning. I would recommend thermography through at the end of the project, just to make sure that the insulation has been installed properly. It's a simple thing, but it can have such a huge impact on the comfort of the home after occupation. And we've actually had building supervisors who've then, like after having these chats with us, have gone and bought building companies who've gone and bought their supervisors all thermal cameras to make sure that the trades have not disrupted all of the insulation when they've been up there doing their electrical runs or their plumbing or whatever it is that goes on up there. So thermography is definitely something that I would recommend, and it's not that expensive. It's really easy to do. It takes about an hour, and then you get like some nice pictures and a report. Blower door testing, and even something like thermal bridging. I would suggest that homeowners actually have their builders actually look at thermal bridging issues and have any steel beams insulated against the outdoors, because they do, the cold spots equal mold spots. And so if you've got a highly thermally conductive steel beam and you have a warm humid climate inside, then you mitigate that risk by insulating that beam and stopping it from cooling down. So
fantastic. Yeah. No, there's some good checks. I was really surprised. I had somebody come here to do a mold analysis for the place, and he had a thermal imaging camera, but it was literally just a lens that fixed over the top of his mobile phone, and then he had a like an Android phone that then opened up in the middle, so he got more screen real estate. But he said he had this little battery pack in his pocket, and then the thermal imaging camera sat over the top of his phone, and he was using then his phone to walk around and show what was happening in the house in terms of the thermal bridging. And it was interesting. Yeah. This house doesn't have much, all the insulation's sort of fallen out in the roof. So there wasn't any hot spots. It was just none of it was working. So
that could be confusing.
It's like we were looking for like wet spots and damp and things like that. And it was like, no, everything's just kind of open. I was like, okay, right.
Well, at least you know
what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
So now if we can dive into the National Construction Code 2022 and the recent changes, I'd love you to take us through some of the things that are exciting you about the changes and what you're seeing in the industry professionals that you're consulting to, how they're wrapping their heads around the changes as well. And just dive into some of that for us, because I know that you've been upskilling yourself, obviously, in understanding these more. I'd be really keen to hear what you're excited about and what you're seeing in the industry.
Well, any progress is good. I am excited about the general direction of the building code. So the main, what I do every day is talking about moisture management and condensation control. So the requirement for like vapor permeable membranes to be used now in climate zones 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 is in the 2022. You now have to use vapor permeable membranes. Climate zones 4 and 5, it's a lower class of membrane than it is in 6, 7, and 8. But there's still a requirement not to trap vapor inside your homes. So that, I mean, we've been building with foil for decades, and it's just the accepted thing. And the education leap that's happening now with builders, you know, talking before about builders who understand this stuff, I'm getting lots and lots of builders calling me, going, I've just found out about this and I'm learning so much and it's so great. And they're really driven to build better. So the building code changes are instigating some of this information, sort of generate questions and the generation of those questions. So yeah, and also the hygrothermal analysis, that's now a performance solution. So you can either use these vapor permeable membranes, or you can get a simulation done using a program called WUFI. That is exciting for me because it's an on paper assessment, but it's a risk analysis that is it's quite tangible. So you can model your wall or your roof build up and get an idea of what your mold risk is going to be over a period of about 10. We simulate 10 years, and all this stuff is what is leading for me towards a better peace of mind for homeowners.
Can you talk through how, because I know you guys perform WUFI analyses, can you talk through how that process actually works and, you know, what a homeowner needs to kind of know about their building to sort of get that WUFI analysis done? Because I think that understanding of the fact that you can actually get data to tell you where the dew point in the wall is going to be, and if that dew point is going to be then at a position or location that's going to cause mold issues down the track and be problematic, is such powerful data for anybody building a home, but particularly those who do suffer from mold illness and those kinds of things. So how does somebody go about getting a WUFI analysis done? What's involved? You know, how much time should they allow? Like what are sort of the steps and processes to get that done for them?
Sure, that's as simple as sending me the wall or roof detail. The floor plan as well. We need to know the volume of the house and how many bedrooms there are. We need to know the location and the orientation. Actually, not the orientation, because we usually just simulate a worst case scenario of a south facing wall build up or roof build up. So there's some basic information about the size of the house and how many people are going to be in it. And that's because we need to know how much moisture is being generated by the cooking and the breathing and whatnot. Then we simulate, we model the wall layers with all the roof layers in the computer system. So, you know, plasterboard insulation, air gap brick or something like that for a brick veneer wall, with the membranes, and we also simulate. Basically, we model the wall or roof build up, and then we saturate it. We basically double the standard water content in every layer. We think about the risk of rain leaks, because at some point over the life of your building, it's likely you're going to get a rain leak from wind-driven rain, or you're going to get vapor dry from inside going through the plasterboard insulation into your wall at some point in the life of that structure. So we simulate all the layers and we saturate them, and then we simulate over time how quickly that's going to dry. And if it doesn't dry, then obviously the mold risk is a lot higher. So there's the critical point in every build up is going to be the first millimetre of the insulation in between next to the water barrier. So we separate out that 1 millimetre and we simulate the mold index in that layer. And if that layer is above a mold index of 3, and the scale goes from 0 up to 6, if that mold index is above 3, then that system can't be built under NCC 2022. And if it is built, then there is a sort of a legal recourse for the builder So,
Gotcha. Right. So that, and like I know that when I've seen, because you did some WUFI for us in a project that we're doing, so and basically we got this diagram of the cross section of the wall, and then when you do look at some, you either get a pass or a fail, and then you it can identify where the dew point is in the wall. So can you tell us a little bit just about what the dew point is and why it matters where that's in the wall, and what information, like what that actually gives you in terms of information about that wall buildup?
so the dew point is the temperature at which the moisture in the air will condensate. So it's also about like if vapor is getting trapped behind a layer in the wall, and that, so for example, the temperature of a foil can drop quickly because it's thermally conductive. So if moisture gets trapped behind that foil, then there's a hot, humid condition behind that foil. The foil is cold, the air condensates and creates a soggy insulation, which over time, if it doesn't dry, which it won't, will create mould. So the dew point depends on the temperature and the relative humidity in the air. So if the temperature or the relative humidity changes, the dew point changes. For example, in a passive house, the temperature of, I think it's 24 degrees and a relative humidity of 60%, the dew point is 12.6. So 12.6 degrees. So if any surface in a passive house gets below 12.6 degrees, then condensation will occur. No surface in a passive house is allowed to get below 12.6 degrees, and it's specifically designed using science for that not to happen. But it is quite easy for a aluminium window frame or a external cladding element, for example, a ColourBond sheet or a metal sheet, to reach that dew point. So if you've got hot, humid air coming into contact with a cold element, then it'll condensate, and it could, become water and drip.
And do you find that people are starting to, because I know that there's the WUFI is something that is, quite regularly used inside the passive house community. Are you seeing people who are doing more traditional builds starting to get WUFI analysis done? Like how are you seeing that knowledge and that data potentially sort of becoming more mainstream and the understanding of it being used?
Yeah, I have been very busy with WUFI at the moment. I'm getting a lot of requests for these sorts of assessments, so it's definitely picking up in awareness in the industry and popularity. I think it's popular because it's an on-paper assessment. You get a number, sort of like a blow door test. You get a number and it gives you some information. And if it does turn out that your wall or roof system has a layer that is going to throw a mold index of 5, then you know that you have to do something about that. You have to change a membrane. You have to introduce a ventilated cavity. You have to change your material to a more mold resistant product. Any number of sort of further risk mitigation strategies to make sure that what you're building is actually going to be safe and healthy.
Yeah, and I think that the fact that the NCC 2022 has introduced that mold index of 3 requirement is going to be really interesting to see how industry generally starts to mitigate their risk by perhaps just including this as part of the services. So the builder, I've heard builders in particular, and they were saying it on the sustainable builders. Yeah, look, if you're using a different wall composition than you've previously used, you should, or working in a different climate that you've previously used in, it's a good risk mitigation exercise as a builder to just get a WUFI on that wall composition so that or that roof composition, so that that it's not going to cause headaches, because now you've got an obligation as a builder to be able to manage that risk for your projects.
Yeah, and a mold index of 3 actually does create some visible mold. So it's not like there's not zero tolerance for mold. There is actually some, a mold index of 3 is a very small amount of visible mold growth. So it's not too crazy. Any visible mold growth isn't ideal, but a below 1 is best practice. But yeah, just to give your listeners an idea of what that 3 actually means, anything above 3 is, quite a large spread of mould and not healthy.
Gotcha. No, that's really good. Thank you for taking us through that in such detail, because I know that will be super helpful for people listening. So, can you dive into what you think is still lacking for the changes to the National Construction Code 2022? What you think they still need to be working on and moving towards?
So, well, we've discussed previously in this podcast already the lack of as-built verification. And that is the entire reason I got into blow testing in the first place, because to me, it was a no-brainer. It was the only way to test whether or not a building, like what state it was in when it was finished. And it was a really good way to assess existing buildings and ways to improve them as well. So I'm not sure how quickly we're going to move to any sort of as-built verification. Blow testing at some point will become a mandatory thing in the building code. I don't know how long we're going to have to wait for that. We're also going to have to upskill a lot of people in Australia to actually be able to deliver on blow testing if it's made mandatory. So yeah, that is probably what I would be looking for as a progression for the building code. The star ratings, as they are sort of going from 6 to 7 stars, something else that I don't think a lot of homeowners understand is that there are other ways to get building code compliance, not just a star rating. So that's a whole other can of worms that we won't go into now. But yeah, understanding how the building code works is a fairly big knowledge gap, and you can't really expect homeowners to understand it. But any opportunity that I get, I sort of mention it, because in my experience, most homeowners don't understand how their houses are assessed. They just think they are assessed.
That's very true, actually. And when you think about the thousands and thousands of standards and, clauses and things like that, that are included just for a residential house in the construction code. And then, of course, there's Australian standards and all of those other regulations as well. It is far too much for a homeowner to be across for their individual project. So I think it's that thing of, understanding. I mean, it's interesting to see the redefinition of sort of pathways through approvals against the National Construction Code, and seeing that sort of be laid out in slightly a different structure as well inside the National Construction Code, and seeing how important it is for you to kind of determine which pathways are going to be meaningful for you, whatever it is that you're seeking to kind of do in your project, really understanding that there's not just one step-by-step sort of way that you're going to necessarily have to achieve your approval, but, looking at what other opportunities there might be based on what you want to do, and, the challenges of your site and all of those kinds of things. That team and that expertise inside your team becomes so critical, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's about having the right people on your team who can explain the things that you might not know. All of the ways of energy compliance in the building code, they're all supposed to perform at essentially the same level. And I think under the 2022 code, they are brought more into alignment with each other. But in the past, they've all thrown quite different results in my experience. So yeah, that's something that I find lacking. But I have, full disclosure, been out of the building code space for a couple of years now. So I'm told the 2022 code brings it much more closely into alignment.
Fantastic. Yeah. So can we dive into how you think homeowners should best work with their builders and their teams to achieve outcomes? Things that I think, if we could just sort of sum up with some of those pointers we've talked about in the episode, and also anything else that you think is relevant for homeowners to understand sort of how to structure this with their team, the kinds of questions to potentially ask when they're sort of first interviewing people, and then how they navigate the design, and then, the documentation, construction, contract process to really make sure that they're nailing this, particularly in the context of a traditional build where they don't necessarily have a certification method like you do in passive house that's going to bolt on all of these requirements, but they're, sort of navigating a traditional system. How do you suggest they sort of best achieve the results that they need to for their home?
I think, and I know that I talk about blow testing a lot, but that's because it's so important. The first question I would ask a builder is, do you know what a blow test is? Because if they do, then you know that there's a whole bunch of other things they already know. And you won't have to go through that whole education process with them. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use that builder, but it just means you know where you will sit. It also depends if you're using an architect or a builder who's doing your design and construct, but going through the whole design process with the intention of airtightness in mind, asking your design team or your construct team if they know what a blow door test is, if they know what a vapor permeable membrane is, then if you get positive answers to both of those questions, then it's going to be smooth sailing. So yeah, they're the things I would recommend. They're fairly simple questions and with fairly simple answers. So
yeah. What are you seeing? This question's a little bit left of field, but what are you sort of seeing with builders adopting this on site? I know, like, you've been working with a few of our Live Life Build members who are sort of just starting to wrap their heads around this for the first time. We've got one builder who, always previously did steel frames, and he's now doing timber frame, and he's starting to use Pro Clima wraps. And he's, you've been on site a lot with, that's Luke Dakey from Saxony Building, helping him understand and his team how to wrap the building properly, because Climasure is obviously also a Pro Clima distributor. So how are you seeing, and I know another Luke, he got you to do some thermal imaging and that kind of stuff. How are you seeing, are you seeing that the builders who actually, what I'm concerned about is that the builders who ask for this and get you to come, they're already trying, and they're using the exercise of working with you as a learning exercise to kind of see what they're missing. So I know, for example, Luke Callery was saying to me, to see actually in the thermal imaging where electricians he didn't realize had moved insulation out of the way. And, there was the opportunity for him to sort that out before handover and that kind of stuff. But then also, obviously, there's a whole raft of builders who you don't get to go to their site, and you don't get to see sort of what's happening, but perhaps the homeowners got you back afterwards or something like that to check, what might have been going wrong. What are you sort of seeing out there in the industry in terms of being on site and in the ground and people wrapping their heads around this stuff, and potentially the on-flow sort of mistakes or concerns or getting it right kind of things that you think would be worth people hearing about?
Well, like you said, in my daily job, I get the good stuff. I get the people who are wanting to learn, or my favorite calls. I had one yesterday from I think it was another Luke. The Lukes love this stuff. And he was like, "Oh, I've been watching YouTube videos all weekend, and this whole thing's opened up, and I'm really excited, and I want to know." So I get a lot of those sorts of phone calls, and I like those sorts of clients because they're open to learning. So as far as going on site with people who have made mistakes, probably the biggest mistakes that we see, that I have seen in the past, is when they haven't used the Pro Clima membranes. They've used a different type of membrane, and the difference between the essential difference, I think, between the Pro Clima system and other types of membranes is the quality of the installation. I mean, the membranes themselves are quite different, but there's a real intention with the install of the Pro Clima membrane. So when you get trades who are installing membranes the way they always have, they often have big rips in them. They're falling off, the tape's coming off. They're not taped into the windows. They're not taped properly at the top and bottom plates. It's one project we actually went on site for, and this particular client was working with a volume builder, but trying to insert high performance principles into the project, and he sort of succeeded, but there were some fairly big sort of weaknesses in the way the building was put together, and the membrane was one of them. There was holes all through it, and he was trying to get an airtight structure, and it just defeated the whole purpose of what he was trying to do, because the frame was open to rain. It was not creating any sort of air barrier. It was so those are the sorts of challenges I come across, because that was driven by the client, not the builder, and I don't think they were communicating too well. So the communication between homeowner and builder is absolutely 100% the most important thing in order to come out at the end with what you want.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, being on the same page, it just makes such a difference, doesn't it? When instead of trying to kind of school the builder on how things need to be done and them not being on board and getting those kinds of outcomes, as you mentioned with that volume builder project. I know that there's, it's so tricky because if you're trying to achieve a project at a particular sort of delivery methodology or a certain speed or at a certain price point, and then you try and bolt these kind of processes in, and without that understanding, then you are going to be pushing uphill all the time. So can you talk a bit? I saw something on your social media a little while ago about the moisture content in frames before you start wrapping them up. I'm just wondering if we can quickly sort of touch on that before we wrap up the episode and just help homeowners understand, because I think that's actually also another really interesting check that's potentially something that homeowners could think about in their construction process, in terms of I know a lot of homeowners are concerned about, timber turning up to site and it's already looks like it's damp or it's sitting out in the rain for a period of time. What are your suggestions in terms of, testing and measuring the thermal moisture, and what benchmark they need to be thinking about before the whole wall gets wrapped up and that moisture gets locked in the wall and then causes dramas down the track?
Yeah, so we've had a really wet winter in Adelaide. It's just rained pretty much nonstop, and I have seen lots and lots of saturated building sites. I also know of someone who unfortunately ended up in court because their frames were clad and insulated, saturated, and they went mouldy. They were building some townhouses. So I know from her experience that it's a serious issue. So I did a bit of reading that day before I made that post, and the research I came across was that your moisture level in your timber should not exceed 15% if it's going to be before it's clad. So you can get moisture meters, preferably the one with the little prongs in them, and you insert the prongs into the timber frame and you measure the moisture content that way. And yeah, 15% is the cap that I read about.
Yeah. No, it was fantastic to see. What I love about these conversations is it gives homeowners an understanding of some kind of checks and tools and things like that to be really chatting about with their builder, so that it's not just about the framing checklist, and going around and checking that the framing's in the right place, but that there's another check that we can do at that point. And some of the, technology that we have, like the thermal imaging cameras, like the moisture meters and those kinds of things, are not actually that costly particularly for a builder to have in their toolkit as well, and give a homeowner a peace of mind, particularly for a builder to be able to do this and demonstrate the quality and the professionalism with which they're kind of delivering their projects. And then you can, obviously, it's then those larger conversations of where's our air barrier? What are we using? Are we using a wrap, or are we relying on the plasterboard? How are we going to test that? So, and get that data. So is there anything else that I haven't covered that you wanted to mention before we wrap up?
No, I think that's been a pretty comprehensive chat.
We have dived into a lot of detail, Jess. I can't thank you enough for all of the information that you've shared in this conversation. And also just, I really encourage listeners to check out Climassure's social media and website. I'll pop the links in the resources. There's a whole heap of blog content there that's super helpful. There's also the social media is really fantastic to follow. Jess, you're doing an enormous amount to educate the industry and to also obviously help the clients that you work with directly. And as you said, the WUFI analysis doesn't actually need to be, for people listening, it doesn't need to be a local thing. You can actually work with somebody remotely, because as Jess outlined, those things are all things that you can email and shoot across, and the climate data is not, is in the tool for everywhere. So so that's really exciting as well, because I know that homeowners are often looking for that process and not quite sure where to go. So thank you so much for your time, Jess. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Amelia. It's been a blast.